The boy found on the road had the judge's last name. The headlights cut through the thick darkness of Route 47, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the skeletal remains of autumn trees. Deputy Sarah Martinez had been driving this stretch for nearly 8 years, but tonight felt different. The radio crackled with static, and an unsettling silence seemed to press against the windows of her patrol car. It was nearly midnight when she saw him, a small figure hunched on the shoulder of the road, barely visible in the dying light of a flickering street lamp. Sarah pulled over immediately, her training kicking in as she approached the child with caution. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his clothes dirty and torn, his dark hair matted against his forehead. He looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his face, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation that made her heart clench. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching down to his level. "What's your name? Are you hurt?" The boy remained silent for a long moment, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Danny," he said. "Danny Harrison." Sarah's blood ran cold. Harrison. Judge Thomas Harrison, the most feared and respected man in Millbrook County, known for his unwavering sense of justice and his reputation for being utterly incorruptible. She had appeared before him countless times in court, watching as he delivered sentences with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of winter itself. The judge had no children. Everyone in town knew that. His wife had died in a car accident 15 years ago, and he had never remarried, never even dated as far as anyone knew. "Harrison," Sarah repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "Like Judge Harrison." Danny nodded slowly, and something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or hope. "He's my father," he said simply, as if stating an undeniable fact. Sarah's mind raced. This was impossible. Judge Harrison lived alone in his massive Victorian house on Elm Street, had done so for years. There had never been any rumors, any whispers about a secret child. The man was practically a hermit outside of court, appearing only for work and the occasional city council meeting. Yet here was this boy carrying his name, his features bearing an uncanny resemblance to the stern face she knew so well from the courtroom. "Where have you been living, Danny?" she asked gently, helping him to his feet. He was smaller than she had first thought, probably malnourished, his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. "Different places," he replied, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "Foster homes mostly. But I kept running away. I wanted to find him. My mum told me about him before she died. She said he didn't know about me, but that he was a good man. She made me promise to find him someday." Sarah's radio crackled to life, dispatching another unit to a domestic disturbance across town. She quickly radioed in her situation, requesting backup and child services, though she knew it would be hours before anyone could respond. Budget cuts had stretched the department thin, and she was essentially on her own until morning. "Okay, Danny," she said, guiding him toward the patrol car. "Let's get you somewhere warm and safe. We need to figure out what's happening here." As they drove toward town, Sarah couldn't help but steal glances at the boy in her rearview mirror. His resemblance to Judge Harrison was striking now that she looked for it. The same sharp jawline, the same intelligent eyes, even the same way of sitting perfectly straight, despite obvious exhaustion. But more than that, there was something in his demeanor that reminded her of the judge's courtroom presence, a quiet dignity that seemed unusual for a child who had apparently been living on the streets. Danny stared out the window at the passing streetlights, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Is he really as scary as people say?" he asked suddenly. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Judge Harrison was known for his stern demeanor and harsh sentences, but she had also seen him show unexpected mercy to first-time offenders and his genuine care for justice. "He's fair," she said finally. "Sometimes that can seem scary, but he's a good man, an honest one." "That's what my mom said," Danny whispered, and Sarah caught the shimmer of tears in his eyes. "She said he would take care of me if something happened to her, but when I tried to find him before, The people at social services said there was no record of him having any children. They thought I was making it up. The patrol car's engine hummed steadily as they entered the outskirts of Millbrook, passing the all-night diner where shift workers grabbed coffee before heading home. Sarah's mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. If this boy was telling the truth, it would turn the entire town upside down. Judge Harrison's private life was a mystery to most people, but the idea that he had a secret son seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was sitting right behind her, scared and alone, but carrying himself with an unmistakable dignity that seemed bred into his bones. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following standard protocol and waiting for child services, she was going to call Judge Harrison directly. If this boy was his son, he deserved to know. And if he wasn't, well, the judge would be the best person to handle the situation with the gravity it deserved. She looked at Danny one more time as they sat in the parking lot, engine idling, both of them on the precipice of a truth that could heal old wounds or tear open new ones. Judge Thomas Harrison's home phone rang at 12:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of his study, where he sat reviewing case files by lamplight. He rarely received calls this late, and his first thought was of some emergency at the courthouse. When Deputy Martinez identified herself, his stern expression deepened into a frown of concern. "Your Honor, I apologize for calling so late, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention," Sarah said, her voice tight with nervousness. "I've found a boy on Route 47. He claims to be your son." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Judge Harrison's voice came through, low and carefully controlled. "Deputy Martinez, I want you to repeat exactly what you just said. A boy, about 10 years old, found alone on the roadside. He says his name is Danny Harrison and that you're his father." Sarah paused, watching Danny through the station's window as he sat quietly in the waiting area, accepting a cup of hot chocolate from Officer Jenkins. "Your Honor, he looks like you. The resemblance is quite strong." Another long pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Judge Harrison said, and the line went dead. Thomas Harrison sat in his leather chair for several moments after hanging up, his hands trembling slightly, something that hadn't happened since his wife Elizabeth's funeral 15 years ago, a son. The word echoed in his mind, bringing with it a flood of memories he had long tried to suppress. There had been someone, briefly, during those dark months after Elizabeth's death, when grief had driven him to seek solace in places he normally wouldn't venture. A young woman named Maria, working at the small cafe outside of town, where he sometimes went to escape the suffocating sympathy of his neighbors. Their relationship had been brief, intense, and ultimately ended when his sense of propriety overcame his need for comfort. He had convinced himself it was for the best. She was young, full of life, deserved better than a widowed judge drowning in his own sorrow. He had never contacted her again, throwing himself back into his work with even greater dedication. But now, as he drove through the empty streets toward the police station, he could see her face clearly for the first time in years. Maria Santos, beautiful, kind, with eyes that seemed to see straight through his judicial armor to the broken man beneath. She had never tried to contact him after he ended things, and he had assumed she had moved on, perhaps left town entirely. The possibility that she had been carrying his child, that she had borne a son and never told him, sent a sharp pain through his chest that had nothing to do with his aging heart. The police station was nearly deserted when he arrived, just Deputy Martinez and Officer Jenkins on duty. Through the glass partition, he could see a small figure sitting in the waiting area, head bent over what appeared to be a coloring book. As Thomas approached, the boy looked up, and the breath left his body in a rush. It was like looking at a photograph of himself at that age. The same dark hair, the same serious expression, even the same way of sitting with perfect posture, despite obvious exhaustion. But it was the eyes that confirmed what his mind was already accepting. They were Elizabeth's eyes, the warm brown that had first captured his heart 30 years ago. Somehow, impossibly, this child carried the genetic legacy of both his parents. "Danny," he said softly, approaching the boy with the same careful deliberation he used in his courtroom. The boy stood immediately, his small frame straightening with a formality that was heartbreaking in its familiarity. "Judge Harrison," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious nervousness. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. I know you didn't know about me." Thomas felt his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling. "Tell me about your mother," he said, settling into the chair across from Danny, his voice gentler than anyone at the courthouse would have recognized. "Her name was Maria Santos," Danny began, his words carefully measured. "She worked at different jobs, but she always said she was proudest of the time she spent at the little cafe outside town. She said that's where she met you, and that you were the kindest man she'd ever known, even though you were very sad." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, the memory of Maria's gentle hands and understanding smile washing over him. "She died recently?" he asked. Danny nodded, his composure finally cracking slightly. "Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but she made me promise to find you if something happened to her. She said you were an honorable man who would do right by me, even though you might not remember her clearly." "I remember her," Thomas said quietly, and the admission seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. She was light during a very dark time in my life. I cared for her deeply, but I convinced myself that ending things was best for her." Deputy Martinez watched from across the room as judge and child sat facing each other, two strangers connected by blood and tragedy, both trying to navigate waters neither had ever imagined. The resemblance between them was undeniable now, not just in their features, but in their mannerisms. The way they both sat perfectly straight, the careful way they chose their words, the dignity they maintained even in this emotional moment. "She never asked for anything," Danny continued, his voice growing stronger. "She just wanted me to know who my father was. She used to tell me stories about you, about how you always tried to be fair, how you helped people even when they made mistakes. She said I had that in me too." Thomas reached out tentatively, placing his hand over Danny's small one. "She was right about you being in my heart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know you existed. If I had known—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had missed. 10 years of birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, first days of school. "She said you would have done the right thing if you'd known," Danny said simply. "She never blamed you for not being there. She said some things are just meant to happen when they're supposed to happen." Indeed, the DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to Judge Harrison's chambers with the clinical precision that characterized most official documents. Thomas stared at the envelope for several long minutes before opening it. Though he had known the truth from the moment he looked into Danny's eyes, the paper confirmed what his heart had already accepted. Daniel Santos Harrison was indeed his biological son, with a 99.97% probability of paternity. The 3 weeks since that night at the police station had been a whirlwind of legal procedures, social worker visits, and cautious getting-to-know-you conversations. Danny had been placed in temporary foster care with the Hendersons, a kind, elderly couple who had been caring for children for over 20 years. Thomas visited every day after court, slowly learning about the son he never knew he had. Danny was remarkably well adjusted for a child who had spent the last 2 years bouncing between foster homes. His mother had clearly instilled strong values in him, along with an education that impressed even Thomas. The boy read voraciously, preferred chess to video games, and had a sense of justice that reminded Thomas painfully of his younger self. More than once, Thomas caught himself wondering what kind of man he might have become if he'd had Danny's gentle wisdom to guide him through his grief. "The paperwork is complete," Thomas told Danny during their daily meeting at the courthouse cafeteria. "If you're willing, I'd like you to come live with me permanently." Danny looked up from the legal book he'd been reading, a simplified version of family law that Thomas had brought him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his maturity heartbreaking in a child so young. "I know this has all been sudden for you. I don't want you to feel obligated just because of biology." Thomas set down his coffee, struck once again by his son's thoughtfulness. "Danny, these past 3 weeks have been the most meaningful of my life since your mother and since I lost my way 15 years ago. You're not an obligation. You're a gift I didn't know I needed." The boy's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, tears spilling down his cheeks as he reached across the table to hug his father. Thomas held him tightly, feeling something heal inside his chest that he hadn't even realized was broken. Around them, court employees and lawyers who had known Judge Harrison for years stopped to stare at this unprecedented display of emotion from the man they had always considered unfeeling. "There's something else," Thomas said gently as Danny pulled back, wiping his eyes with the dignity that seemed to come naturally to him. "I want to honor your mother's memory properly. Would you like to change your name legally to Harrison, or would you prefer to keep Santos as well?" "Could I be Daniel Santos Harrison?" Danny asked hopefully. "I want to carry both names. Mom always said names tell stories, and I want to remember all of my story." Daniel Santos Harrison it is," Thomas agreed, making a note to have his assistant prepare the necessary paperwork. "And Danny, there's a room in my house that's been empty for too long. I'd like your help making it yours." The transition wasn't without its challenges. Thomas had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how to share space, how to consider another person's needs in his daily routine. Danny, meanwhile, had lived in survival mode for so long that he sometimes hoarded food in his room or woke up disoriented, forgetting where he was. But slowly, carefully, they built a routine together. Mornings began with breakfast, Thomas learning to cook more than just coffee and toast. Danny setting the table with the precision of someone who had learned to make himself useful wherever he went. Evenings were spent in Thomas's study, Danny doing homework while Thomas reviewed cases, both of them comfortable in the companionable silence. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people, like Deputy Martinez and the Hendersons, were delighted to see Judge Harrison's transformation from a cold, isolated figure into someone who smiled when he talked about his son's latest achievement. Others whispered about impropriety, about the stern judge who had apparently fathered a child out of wedlock and somehow kept it secret for 10 years. Thomas found he cared less about public opinion than he had expected. For the first time in 15 years, he had something more important than his reputation to consider. He had a son who needed stability, love, and guidance. Danny had already shown remarkable resilience, but Thomas could see the fear lingering behind his eyes, the fear of abandonment that came from losing too many people too young. "Judge Harrison?" Danny asked one evening as they worked together on a jigsaw puzzle, a surprisingly relaxing activity that had become their routine. "Do you think Mom would be happy about us finding each other?" Thomas looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had somehow inherited the best qualities of both his parents while developing a strength entirely his own. "I think," he said carefully, "that your mother was wiser than either of us realized. She knew exactly what she was doing when she told you to find me." Danny smiled, the first truly carefree expression Thomas had seen from him. "She always said everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see it at the time." As Thomas watched his son carefully fit another piece into the puzzle, he realized that Maria had been right about more than just the timing of their reunion. She had been right about the kind of man Thomas could become with the right motivation. For 15 years, he had hidden behind his judicial robes, using his position to maintain distance from human emotion. But Danny's presence was slowly teaching him that true justice, like true love, required not distance, but connection. 6 months after Danny came to live with him, Thomas Harrison found himself standing before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that no longer trembled. The man looking back at him seemed younger somehow, despite the silver threading through his hair at an accelerated pace. His eyes, once hard as winter stone, now held warmth. a reflection of the laughter that had begun to echo through the halls of his once silent house. "Dad, you're going to be late for court," Danny called from the kitchen, using the title that still sent a jolt of joy through Thomas's chest every time he heard it. "Coming," Thomas called back, marveling at how natural the morning routine had become. Danny had his lunch packed, his homework organized in his backpack, and was reading the morning newspaper with the same intensity Thomas brought to legal briefs. The boy had started 6th grade at Millbrook Elementary, where his teachers quickly discovered they had a student who could discuss current events with the sophistication of someone twice his age. The drive to school had become Thomas's favorite part of the day. Danny would share stories about his classmates, ask thoughtful questions about the cases Thomas was hearing, and occasionally offer insights that reminded the judge why he had fallen in love with the law in the first place. This morning, however, Danny was quieter than usual, staring out the window at the autumn leaves that carpeted their neighborhood. "Something on your mind?" Thomas asked as they pulled into the school parking lot. Danny turned to face him, his expression serious. "There's going to be a father-son picnic next month at school." He paused, suddenly uncertain. I know you're really busy with work." "Danny," Thomas interrupted gently, "I wouldn't miss it for anything. In fact, I'll block the entire afternoon on my calendar right now." The relief on Danny's face was immediate and profound. "Really? Even if you have important court stuff?" "You are the most important thing in my life," Thomas said simply, and meant it. "Everything else can wait." As Danny bounded out of the car toward his friends, backpack bouncing with each step, Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not the old pain of loneliness, but something new and overwhelming. Pride, love, the fierce protectiveness that he was beginning to understand was at the heart of fatherhood. The transformation in Thomas's professional life had been as dramatic as his personal one. Colleagues noted that his sentences, while still fair and carefully considered, had developed a new dimension of compassion. He found himself seeing the human stories behind the cases more clearly, understanding how circumstances and choices led people to his courtroom. His reputation as a harsh judge was slowly giving way to one of a fair but understanding one. "Your Honor," Attorney Rebecca Mills said during a custody hearing later that morning, "I have to say, your questions today have been incredibly insightful. You seem to really understand what these families are going through." Thomas nodded, thinking of Danny's story, of Maria Santos raising their son alone, of the foster care system that had failed to keep families together, of the fear he had seen in his son's eyes those first few weeks. "Perspective changes everything, Ms. Mills. Sometimes we need to see through different eyes to truly understand justice." That afternoon, Thomas kept his promise and left court early to attend Danny's soccer game. He had never attended a youth sporting event before, and he found himself surprisingly invested in the outcome. When Danny scored his first goal of the season, Thomas stood and cheered with the other parents, his judicial dignity momentarily forgotten in the pure joy of paternal pride. Judge Harrison, Mrs. Chen, Danny's teacher, approached him after the game. "I wanted to talk with you about Danny's progress. He's doing exceptionally well academically, but more than that, he's become a real leader in the classroom. He helps other students, shows incredible empathy, and has a natural sense of fairness that's remarkable in someone his age." Thomas watched Danny packing up his soccer gear with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. "He gets that from his mother," he said quietly. "Maria Santos was one of the kindest people I've ever known. She raised him to be better than either of us could have imagined. He talks about her sometimes," Mrs. Chen said gently. "It's clear she had a profound impact on him. But Judge Harrison, I want you to know that the changes in Danny since he came to live with you have been remarkable too. He's more confident, more secure. Whatever you're doing, it's working." That evening, as they sat at the dinner table sharing stories from their respective days, Danny asked a question that stopped Thomas mid-sentence. "Dad, do you think you and Mom would have gotten married if she hadn't gotten sick? If you had known about me from the beginning?" Thomas considered the question carefully, wanting to give Danny the honesty he deserved. "I think," he said slowly, "that your mother and I loved each other in a way that was right for that time in our lives. We were both healing from different kinds of pain. Whether we would have built a life together, I don't know. But Danny, I want you to understand something important. You weren't a mistake. You were never a mistake. You were love made manifest, even if the circumstances weren't traditional." Danny nodded solemnly, processing this with the maturity that never ceased to amaze Thomas. She used to say that love doesn't always look like the movies. Sometimes it's quiet or brief or comes when you don't expect it, but it's still real. "Your mother was a wise woman," Thomas said, feeling the familiar ache of gratitude mixed with regret. "I wish I had been brave enough to truly know her when I had the chance." "But you know me," Danny pointed out with the practical logic that reminded Thomas so much of himself. "And through me, you get to know parts of her too. She's still here in a way." As Thomas tucked Danny into bed that night, a routine that had taken weeks to feel natural but now seemed essential, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now rang with laughter and conversation. His work, while still demanding, no longer consumed him entirely. He had rediscovered not just the capacity for love, but the courage to be vulnerable, to risk his heart for the possibility of connection. "Dad?" Danny's voice came softly from the darkness. "Thank you for wanting me, even though it was scary and complicated and everyone had opinions about it." Thomas sat back down on the edge of the bed, his throat tight with emotion. "Danny Santos Harrison," he said firmly, "wanting you was the easiest decision I've ever made. Everything else was just logistics." As he turned off the light and headed toward his own room, Thomas paused at the framed photograph that now sat on Danny's nightstand, a picture of Maria Santos holding a chubby-cheeked toddler, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. He had found it among Danny's few possessions, and seeing it had brought both pain and profound gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to the image as he did every night. "Thank you for taking such good care of our son. Thank you for teaching him to find me. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something new." In his own room, Thomas looked out his window at the quiet street where he had lived in isolation for so many years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to guide his son through the complexities of growing up. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Judge Thomas Harrison went to sleep in a house filled with love, with the sound of another person's breathing down the hall, with the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged.